Many would agree that investing in U.S. industrialization and technology leadership will require large amounts of patient capital. In some quarters, this has prompted a fairly open reevaluation of how private investors can allocate capital towards national goals. Things like reviving manufacturing, expanding power generation capacity, reviving shipbuilding, and much more. Is national interest investing the preoccupation of a few, or a movement that's catching on? Can private investors do this kind of investing without sacrificing their financial goals, high and consistent returns? And what, if anything, should government do to encourage this type of investing, or at least not discourage it? I'm Navin Girishankar, and I'm excited to be talking about these issues with David Ulevitch, general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, on this episode of Betting on America. David Ulevitch, thank you so much for joining. I have been a fan and admirer of the work that you're doing and your various writings ever since you all launched your American Dynamism initiative at Andreessen Horowitz, so I'm really excited about this conversation.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's start with that. I think it was January 2022, you all launched the American Dynamism Initiative, and then subsequently a fund. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and then we could explore further?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, so first of all, I joined the firm, Andreessen Horowitz, in 2018. And if you think about that era and that time, that was, investing in defense companies was not in vogue. It was probably the opposite. Investing in public safety was not in vogue. In 2021, in 2019, I met Catherine Boyle. We both invested in a company called Anduril together.
Yeah.
We can talk a little bit about how we both decided to invest in that company. But we met then, and we shared a lot of the similar values and this idea that there are just foundational aspects of America that needed to be transformed with advanced technology, that needed to take advantage of rapid advancements in everything from autonomy, computer vision, large-scale data processing. And these are things like the defense industrial base, the manufacturing industrial base. And this is even, we had COVID as a recent experience when this was happening. And, by January of 2022, we fully understood our supply chain dependency on China. We understood at that point, we saw that things were getting spicy in different parts of the world. And we started to get a taste that our defense industrial base was probably not as modern as we thought that it was. And so Catherine actually joined me in 2021, and we created the American Dynamism practice. And what that means is investing in companies that support the national interest. And the national interest is a vague but in broad term, but largely it's the categories that I think make the American dream more real. Yeah. So that's everything from a strong defense, housing, transportation and logistics, energy, which is just a foundational component of the way we live and work, space, communications. There's a whole bunch of things under that broad umbrella. And as we built an investing practice around that, and we can talk about why we think venture capital is suited for this, we've really focused our investing practice. So there's sort of like the marketing umbrella of American Dynamism, but then there's an investing focus, and that's really defense, energy, public safety, and space. We're increasingly looking at manufacturing and some other things, but that is what American Dynamism is, and that's what we do.
Fascinating and inspiring as investors beginning to focus on things that have a national interest orientation is like, it's a new thing. And the question I have is, is this the preoccupation of a few visionary people, or is this the beginnings of a movement in the investment community? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a movement. I think investors are now paying attention, but I think it's a movement largely of the builders, of the entrepreneurs. There's certainly a marketing component to American Dynamism. When we first launched the practice, we would see sort of like the haters on Twitter would say like, oh, American Dynamism is just marketing. And my reaction to that was always like, well, what company doesn't have marketing? Of course there's marketing.
Yeah.
Like what enterprise business wouldn't have marketing? and it's true, but it's really about getting, and the reason that there's marketing is to reach the builders and entrepreneurs. And we've seen this huge shift in people that want to build companies where they want to do well, right? They want to build companies that create something of real value, both for their shareholders, for themselves, but also they want to do something that's good and actually does something that contributes to the national fabric, to the national interest, to their communities, to their neighbors. And so they recognize that there's this huge opportunity to build these kinds of companies, whether it's a defense company, whether it's a space company, to make sure that we have, all kinds of new capabilities in space as that domain becomes increasingly important, whether it's energy companies that deal with our insatiable thirst for energy. And then I think on the investor side, there's a recognition that there's opportunity, right? So investors, I think, generally, we were early, I would say, to this trend, but now we see many other firms entering both what I call upstream capital and downstream capital. So people that are willing to do checks even before we come in, and we're pretty early, but pre-seed investors that are excited about investing in American Dynamism. But more importantly, the biggest change for us since launching the practice in 22 is that there's a lot more downstream investors, people that are willing to write the very large checks.
Yeah.
Their project financing. There's a lot more capital available for these large manufacturing expansion projects that are needed,
right.
To satisfy large defense contracts, to build out energy supply chains, and that has been a critical piece. And we can chat more about that in a bit.
Yeah, and I want to double click on that. I spoke to Mike Brown at Shield Capital a few months ago, and big fan of what he's been writing about and doing. He underscored something that I wanted to just ask you, which is that if you look at venture capital over the last decade or so, obviously there was a crowding into software ventures. And really, I guess a lot of VC were shy about capital intensive ventures. And one of the things in listening to some of your earlier podcasts and things you've written about, there's an accent on investing in the physical world, as you say, meaning doing those capital-intensive things that have a long tail, things that VC had largely shied away from. Like, is this simply a matter of preference on the part of investors, or is it a matter of thinking about opportunities that they were simply blind to in the past?
No, I think that a number of things have happened. So one is that historically these categories, people have always felt like they're low margin, that the production timeline is very, very protracted and difficult, that it's oftentimes labor gated. On the customer side, there's cost plus contracting, which limits your ability to really expand the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been historical, I think, lots of sort of demand side systemic reasons why people thought these were not great businesses to be in. And on the supply side, I don't think, no offense to people that have worked in the defense industrial base, they've built amazing products, but you've never had sort of the builders who come from Silicon Valley who can introduce really advanced technology using commercial off-the-shelf hardware, right?
Yeah.
Using commodity hardware with advanced software. That's never been done before. And so I think on the supply side, we're now entering an era where a couple things have changed. One is that there's builders bringing advanced technology and advanced software and largely commodity hardware to things like the defense industrial base.
Yeah.
That creates an opportunity to build much higher margin businesses, much higher margin outcomes, do a lot more automation in the factory, do a lot more things that have never been done before from a production standpoint that I think will change the economics on the margins. And the contracting model on the buyer side is changing, where it's no longer just tied and tethered to cost plus contracting models. And so the ability to have real margin expansion and have a 40, 50, 60% margin business where there's also a software component also now exists. So that's one. The other thing I would say is that, traditionally in venture capital, looking at just like enterprise software and consumer software, I believe, and we'll see if I'm right in 10 years from now, that there's going to be tremendous margin compression in enterprise software. So businesses like SaaS software, lots of investors love enterprise SaaS.
Yeah.
I think historically things that have been high margin, now that those business models are maturing and the competition in those markets is getting much more fierce. And I think as IT buyers don't want to spend $30 per user per month on software, we're going to see margin compression in those businesses, where in defense and in space and in manufacturing, we're actually going to see margin expansion, which will ultimately create much more valuable companies than we've seen in the past.
Thank you for sharing. That's such a great perspective that I think it's just to wrap one's head around that. Let me ask you this question. Some people would say, well, national interest investing, given the broad set of sectors you're talking about, how do you actually have an investment thesis around such a large number of sectors? Because it's kind of like a big component of the economy when you think about it.
Yeah, it's massive. Look, we try to stay focused. So from the large umbrella of American Dynamism, there's lots of things that we could touch that we don't really touch because we don't have expertise. So like one of the largest issues that is relevant to the national interest would be healthcare. Well, our team doesn't do that because we don't have any healthcare expertise. We have a team inside the firm, inside Andreessen Horowitz, that does focus on healthcare. But in American Dynamism, we exclude that because it's a huge, huge category. It's massively important, but we don't focus there. We very much limit our focus on education, hugely important to the national interest, but not something where we have a lot of expertise and where we see the opportunity to invest yet. We've made a couple investments here and there, but broadly we sort of stay. So we focus really, when we look at defense, we think we have the ability to understand the contracting process, the buyer. We can communicate with the buyers, we can do diligence there. We know a lot of the builders. These builders are coming out of SpaceX, Tesla, Palantir, and other companies, so they know how to build at the intersection of software and hardware. So we focus there. In space, similarly, we have a strong understanding. We know lots of people coming out of SpaceX, and we're able to diligence these companies. In energy, we do the same things. And while they are capital intensive, they are hardware companies, most of these companies are either what we call full stack, where they basically don't rely on all these other suppliers and vendors. They try to do everything in-house the way SpaceX does. And so we can better evaluate their ability to control their own destiny. Or, in some cases, we even shift our lens a little bit left to these companies. It's like, okay, well, if we're doing defense, what does defense need? Well, it needs material sciences companies. Are there ways to invest in material sciences companies that use advanced software? So we look at that. We look at energy companies. We know that energy, whether it's to power the transition to electric vehicles or to power our AI data centers, we have this insatiable thirst for energy. Is there a way to build a modern energy company, whether it's a battery company or a power company, that actually leverages advanced manufacturing or advanced software to do something that's higher margin and differentiated, that gets us off of a supply chain dependency, for instance, with batteries from China? Like, are there those opportunities? So we do try to focus, and I think that for us has been a winning formula so far. And we feel like we've put ourselves in a position now to very quickly evaluate every major deal in the market. And I think, and the founders recognize that we have expertise in these areas.
Yeah. I mean, there are two things here. One is your broad framing of national interest investing, I think, has some benefits for people beyond your firm and beyond your founders. Like, just, it's a valuable way of thinking about private investing. And then obviously you're playing on a field where you have an edge. Like, that's where you guys are working. But I think that these are just two things to keep in mind, because others may pick up other sectors where they have an edge, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, that's right. I always think of it kind of like there's the marketing umbrella of American Dynamism, and then there's the investing focus. In fact, when we get a pitch for a company that we think is really interesting but doesn't really fit our investing focus, we'll pass it off to another investor that we think might be a better fit, who's still excited about investing in these American Dynamism companies. In fact, we think that's really healthy for the ecosystem. And again, part of the idea of American Dynamism is to get people excited about working in these industries, building companies in these categories, getting the government excited. We have a whole, we've built out kind of a whole policy and government affairs team in Washington to make sure that, while private capital, I think, is probably a cornerstone of making this work, you cannot do it completely independently of government.
And I want to touch on that issue. That's an important issue. One last thing before we go there. Here's a question for you. Some people would look at this and I'm just going to put this out there, and you tell me if I'm wrong here. Some people will look at this and say, well, this kind of sounds like ESG was 10 years ago, right? So I have financial goals, I have non-financial goals. I'm going to find a way as an investor to pursue both of them and make those available to whichever LPs are investing in this fund. And so the non-financial goals in the past were ESG. Now they're kind of this broad set of national interest goals, right? Here's the question. Are we saying that you do not have to give up some returns to do this because of the structural things that you mentioned are happening? Like, you could generate great alpha in this set of sectors. You're not giving up return. There's no ratio degradation as a result of investing in these areas. You can have your cake and eat it too. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say we are totally returns focused, and I would say that investing in American dynamism to me is like, if we don't make sure that America has, and her allies has sort of global dominance, that, I believe in sort of the West and the criticality of the West. If we don't have technological superiority, then it doesn't matter all the other categories that people invest in, because there will be no other categories to invest in. It's that's sort of like a high level answer to that, but more specifically, ESG was sort of a good idea, I think, in theory, and then in practice, it got very, very distracted, I think, by both people that broadened the term to include companies that really shouldn't have. People would focus on things like climate change instead of focusing on a transition to clean energy, right? So I would never say I'm a climate change investor, but I certainly, I've made a nuclear power investment, and I view that as helping us transition to much cleaner energy sources. We have a company that uses solar energy to create large-scale batteries, right? So those are all things that people would have previously called ESG, but we would never use that term because we think that term has sort of been hijacked by grifters and other folks. But the idea was good. But of course, we don't think we have to sacrifice returns just to make these investments. In fact, we think the opposite is true. This is where we think that the alpha is, where higher margin outcomes will be created, where larger, these are industries that have not been radically transformed with advanced technology, in some cases for 100 years, right? The steelmaking process is not radically different than it's been for a long time. In fact, if you look at construction technology and housing, we build houses today kind of the same way that Jesus did when he carried a hammer. Like, it's not that different. And there's opportunity to say, well, maybe if we have a housing shortage in this country, maybe there's a better way to build houses with better construction materials, better, material sciences properties on these materials, and better processes for the construction supply chain, from lumber to everything from the sheetrock to everything in between.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the role of the state and the role of government. Let's go to that, because when I talk to folks who are part of this movement, and I've talked to a few of them, obviously they say something that is really powerful, especially for someone of like my age, which is that you could be a private investor and you can also be mission driven in a way that has benefits to the country. That's powerful. That's empowering. But then when you scratch the surface, it's not just about the private sector. There are some things government needs to do to make this happen more effectively. So you've written about this. You've been critical about bureaucracy. You've been critical about government getting in the way. Can you just crystallize your thinking on what government can do to make this more effective, easier to do, more the rule rather than the exception?
Yeah, I mean, this is there was a very long answer to this question. I'm going to try to attempt to give a succinct answer. I think the first is that you have to have a general understanding that over the last 70 years or so, the government in this country has increasingly, as our government has increasingly become a gerontocracy, along with that, many of the institutions within the government have become calcified and highly bureaucratic, and largely have grown and bloated themselves to basically sustain their own self-interest. And so that means that there is increasingly more and more regulatory oversight, more and more bureaucratic oversight, And this even applies to things like the Pentagon, where we want, we want the sword of America to be as sharp as possible, and yet there are now all these processes when it comes to how does the Pentagon buy a new technology or a new capability, and a lot of these things have been layered on year after year after year to prevent people from, behaving maybe in an unethical way or to do self-dealing, and they all have the best interest in mind, but when you stack them up over and over
Yeah.
time, it becomes impossible to do business with the government. And I'll give you an example. You could be a new company that has a great new product and a new technology, and you want to sell that to Special Operations Command to make sure that our warfighters have the best capability. Well, for many contracts that work inside the Pentagon, you have to agree to be audited and to have all your financials audited and to have a ton of oversight in these contracts. Well, that makes sense when the government is funding your R&D. But when venture capitalists are funding your R&D, you don't need that auditing and accounting and oversight. We're taking on that R&D risk. We're
Yeah.
not going to ask the government to pay for that. So let's just get rid of all the auditing and accounting requirements, because a small company can't afford to deal with that kind of overhead, both financially and just logistically.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two, a lot of contracts will say, well, what have you done for the government in the past? Well, if you're a brand new company, you may not have done anything for the government in the past. Well, that should not be a demerit, because we want to encourage new technologies and new solutions from new companies. We don't want to just favor the legacy incumbents at every single turn in a big contract. We want to say, hey, why don't we do a bake-off? Say, here are the requirements. Whoever shows up, whether it's Raytheon or a tiny new startup that came out of a garage, whoever shows up to the bake-off and does the best job, they win the contract. Let's just do it that way.
Yeah.
Let's not care about past performance.
Yeah.
And so there's just a long list of bureaucratic and calcified things. And this, I was giving examples on the Pentagon, but there are these examples that exist in the Department of Energy, that exist in Treasury, and they exist all over the government. And so the goal is to say, okay, well, how can we actually work with government to say, can we create, and Mike Brown, who you've had on your show, is a great example of this. He ran DIU, where
Yep.
DIU said, wait, let's create a new pathway for startups to get into the government.
Right.
And those are really, really important programs, right?
Yeah.
We need things like DIU so that startups have a fair shot at introducing their technology into the Department of War. And the same thing applies for the Department of Energy. Secretary Wright at DOE is now focused on how do we introduce new energy products into the market. We see this with Secretary Burgum at the Department of Interior. And so you have to be able to spend time working with the government. And one thing that I think investors can do that startups don't do is that startups are really just focused on not dying and building their product. So as investors, we can say, well, wait a minute, you focus on not dying and building your product. We're going to go spend time in Washington working with legislators, working with program officers, working with bureaucrats in the different departments to say, hey, here's what's happening in Silicon Valley. Here's what's happening with these companies. How can we help them work with you better? How can we make sure that that programs like DIU, for instance, are really important, that DARPA is important? How do we make sure that these conduits and pathways to really bridge Silicon Valley and Washington can work?
Let me say a couple of things. One is that I couldn't agree with you more about the need for public sector reform. And in two ways. One is there are things around acquisition in now the Department of War that you talked about. Fully agree. I agree with the innovative schemes such as the one that Mike Brown had led. But there's also the role of government in terms of fostering an investment climate, even away from things that involve direct contracting. And I think again, you've laid that out quite well. Let me add something here, though. I worked on public sector reform issues around the world when I was at the World Bank, many, many countries. How you do this is as important as what you're trying to do. And I do think that there's a question about the volatility and unpredictability of how some of this has transpired, particularly in the last 10 months, which can add to, it kind of doesn't help the investment climate. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I agree with the goals. I agree with the need to move. We can't waste time. China's moving very quickly. But if we get that wrong in how we do it, we might actually be one step forward, two steps back.
For sure. Look, and I think there are so many incredible things about the way I can only speak to the United States, but there's so many incredible ways, things about the way that the United States works and operates, even as a government. But there are, of course, very frustrating things. And that means that, We have congressional elections every 2 years. We have Senate elections every 6 years. We have a new president every 4 years. And these things create volatility because policies shift, priorities shift, things change, and we're making long-term investments, right? When I
Right.
invest in a startup, I'm thinking on a 10-year horizon or even longer.
Yeah.
And so it is difficult. It is important that government be sort of, I would say, an even keel.
Right.
Now, that said, there is such a need for reform and a shift in mindset from the way the government does business with the private sector that I would actually trade that need for an even keel with a certain period of volatility if
Yeah.
the end result will be a new even keel that is more streamlined, more straightforward, easier to work with. And you can look at things like an energy policy, for instance.
Right.
We need clarity that there is going to be a surge of focus and regulatory support for nuclear power, for instance.
Right.
And I have to believe that if that gets catalyzed, that's what's happening now in the DOE, that momentum will carry forward into whatever the next administration is.
Yeah.
If we show up, in 3 years and there's a new administration and they say, you know what, nuclear energy is out, obviously that would be very, very destabilizing and very destructive.
Yeah. I don't disagree. I think you've said it really quite well. I think getting clear on the goals and the metrics for what change looks like is going to be important. You say something else in some of your writings. Let me just quote you. You say that playing defense with tariffs and export controls is not enough if China and others cut off critical resources from America and our allies, or worse, if the rest of the world doesn't want what we have to offer, even worse if we no longer produce things at all. Beautifully stated. And so I think this is a really important question. I've been looking at how what I would call economic security policy has evolved across the last 3 administrations, Trump 1.0, Biden, Trump 2.0. There's a lot of continuity around this that people don't realize. And I think there's a lot of common problems also, which is a tendency to focus on let's rest on our laurels and let's try to defend what we have rather than surge and innovate faster. And I just want you to share your thoughts on this because I think this is the crux of what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, look, COVID, I think if some people's eyes may have been open before COVID, but COVID should have opened up everyone's eyes that we have systemic reliance and dependence on China. Our greatest adversary is our strongest economic partner at the same time, which is just an incredibly challenging situation to be in. And it does not allow America to be the leader, I think, that it needs to be. And it puts us at a major national security risk domestically here. And so reshoring production, and people use other terms, nearshoring, friendshoring, all that's fine. But I would say that having production in North America, which does not require our supply chain to be dependent on crossing a large ocean or our supply chain to be dependent on China in specific, is of national security, probably the utmost criticality to our national security.
Yeah.
And that requires the government to invest in both from a, less from a financial standpoint, but really from a policy and regulatory standpoint, and sort of, clearing the forest to allow things like manufacturing for everything from motors, batteries, advanced materials, carbon fibers, redo mining and refinement and extraction in this country, where we have massive deposits of even lithium and copper and nickel and all these things that we need for our technology base in this country. We need the government to say, all these environmental, regulatory things that we've layered on year after year after year, migratory bird studies before you can build your factory, all these things that come up in all these regional areas. We need to be able to create at least some level of clearing the path to allow manufacturing to flourish in this country. And that some of that is investment, but a lot of it is just removing just oodles of regulatory overhead and policy overhead that prevents building in America. And I'm not even touching some of the labor issues which exist here, which I think can be managed, but a lot of it has to do with just zoning issues, environmental reviews, and endless law after law after law that just needs to, in the compliance of these things, is almost impossible to keep up with and really prevents us from being competitive on a global stage anymore.
Yeah, I think that's well stated. How do you view the balance between that, meaning improving our effectiveness and our efficiency, with preserving some modicum of the public interest. Because the difference between us and China is, like, we do have a system that's interested in, that vouchsafes the public interest, including those that may be left behind.
For sure, totally important. I mean, again, not to keep pointing back to COVID, but if you look at China's response to COVID, it was a totally authoritarian response.
Right.
They did full lockdowns. They tried to create a vaccine. It was not particularly effective.
Yeah.
And if you look at what America did what it does best, which is really lean on capitalism and lean on innovation. But the government said, if you make a vaccine, we promise we will buy it. We guarantee you that we will buy it. And we had two, maybe three, depending on how you count, three working vaccines in a record amount of time. That is America at its best.
Absolutely.
Where the government said, if you build it, we will buy it. And we had multiple vendors now coming up with a solution. They cleared all the red tape. They got through all the FDA approving a vaccine in record time. And this is like unheard of, right?
Yeah.
And so the government was totally aligned. They called it warp speed because it really did happen at just incredible pace. And so that we need to see things like Operation Warp Speed. Now, that was a moment of crisis. We need people to understand that when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to batteries, when it comes to the defense industrial base, we are in that moment of crisis right now. Yeah. We see that when China, I have three investments. I have three companies that I've invested in who are on what China refers to as the unreliable entities list, which is just an incredible name for a list. But when you get put on the unreliable entities list, you can no longer buy products from China. So I have three investments that are American companies. They cannot buy batteries from China. Let me tell you, when you get put on that list and China says you can no longer buy batteries from our country, it sucks. There's not a lot of other places to buy batteries from, and certainly not at a cost that's competitive.
Right.
And so then the question is, those are just three of my companies. Imagine when all of America gets prohibited from buying batteries from China. Yeah. It would be devastating, or any other material. Yeah. What if we can't buy steel anymore? And so we are in the crisis right now, and it does require the government to treat it like a crisis and say, okay, now we're going to clear the decks. We want steel manufacturing and smelters to be spun back up, to be rebuilt. We want to transform the way that we produce lumber in this country, carbon fiber, chemicals manufacturing. Like all these things are critical, and we can do them. America is blessed with all the natural resources, tons of land, and incredible people. And so we can certainly do these things here, but we do need to treat it like a crisis.
You talk about the role of the state. Let me ask you, a government getting out of the way. Let me ask you something else, because there's a lot of talk in town here in Washington about sovereign wealth funds of various kinds. And you hear a lot of ideas here. Some look jealously at the Gulf countries and say, well, we should have a PIF or an ADIA or something massive like that, or like the Norwegian fund. We don't have the money. We're in the midst of a record high deficit spending. I want your thoughts on that, and because I think there are probably some things where there is a public finance rationale in some limited areas, but if the national interest investing movement catches on, it really begs the question: look, what's the role of a large sovereign, fund like that? Is that even needed?
Yeah, well, a bunch of perspectives on this. One is that the idea that I think there's an argument to be made that we do have a sovereign wealth fund. The government owns 25% of the profits of every company in America. So if companies are profitable and they pay their taxes, the government receives value from that. Right. And I think the government focuses more about how do we get more than 25% instead of focusing on how do we increase the value of that 25%? How do we make sure that there's more profits coming into the system, which funds the government through revenue? So there are, and so when I meet a solo founder, and I ask them, oh, do you have any co-founders? And they say no. Well, it's like, well, of course you have a co-founder. You've given 25% to Uncle Sam right off the bat.
Right.
And I think that we should use that perspective as a way to think about how do we increase the value of these companies that we're creating? How do we make sure that and again, do this in a way that preserves the longevity of America and this planet and all those things, but how do we increase the value of the companies we're creating? And I think that that's one lens. The second is that the government has a role to play even outside of a sovereign wealth fund, where they can, again, just streamline by removing regulations, simplifying contracting processes, removing some of the calcification of making doing business even easier. And then over the long term, there's been new initiatives. I think, actually another VC has been a huge proponent of this idea of giving every young new baby in America, like some kind of a savings, this $1,000 savings account. I don't know if you read about this.
Yeah.
Well, that could just be focused on investments in America. And over time, to me, that sounds like a more American way of doing it than a sovereign wealth fund, which is that everyone participates in the growth of America. And as tech, which is probably the largest GDP driver in this country, if people have investments in the new technology companies that power all these categories of American dynamism, they're going to participate in that value creation, which will benefit all Americans that are being born here.
Yeah, interesting idea. I think the other thing that you've written about, which I found intriguing, is that aside from a national sovereign wealth fund, understand that there are all these American publics across the country, institutional investors with public pensions, whether the large ones in California or Texas or Illinois or elsewhere. Those are, in a sense, public funds that have public stakeholders, and you could make the case, as you have, that they should be looking at their asset allocations and looking at national interest investing. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I forgot to mention that. I mean, when we look at RLPs are oftentimes the pensions, even the county pensions, state and local pensions. It's not just private pensions, but so we have those are that along with major foundations and university endowments. Those are our investors, and so of course when they invest in us, they're participating in the growth of the American Dynamism investor base. So of course that's a good point.
How do you go about doing that? I mean, there's an educational aspect to it, right?
I think I do spend a lot of time with investors. I certainly evangelize the mission of American Dynamism and the vision. I think people are excited by it, and I think they're starting to see, thanks to the work of companies that are early in our movement, companies like Anduril, or even if they look at SpaceX, which predates us, they recognize that these are companies that are not only building incredible value, but they're just absolutely essential to our national security and our American way of life. I think today people can look at SpaceX and just recognize that SpaceX is responsible for our complete ability to put things in space today at a rapid rate. They're launching the Falcon 9, I think, up to 3 or 4 times per week.
Right.
That is just transformative for a national security standpoint. If the United States if they wanted to launch a satellite into space to repair or replace a broken satellite, they might have to wait many, many months in the past. Now they can get on a launch with SpaceX next week. If their satellite's ready to go,
right,
they can get it into orbit next week. That level of capability never existed before SpaceX, and it's truly transformative. Starlink has transformed communication. So I think people realize one of the things that frustrates me so much about there's constant badgering, I think, of the tech industry because of how much tech touches all parts of our lives. But tech is what advances this country forward and drives economic growth.
No question.
To not be the technologically superior country of the world is to really do a massive disservice to America for the next 100 years and beyond.
Let's end on that, because I want to talk to you about this for a minute. You cited in some of your writings a number of these metrics where the U.S. is behind China or ahead of China. China is ahead in a number of areas relative to maybe even a few years ago. I have a particular perspective. We'll be putting something out in the next few months on this, which is that every time there's a DeepSeek moment, fine, it's important to know that there's a DeepSeek moment. It's even more important to know why there was a DeepSeek moment. The underlying drivers of technology innovation and scaling in their ecosystem, in ours, and how do these ecosystems stack up against each other? Not only on, say, stack technologies, but other ones, base technologies and production technologies. So when you look at those numbers that you cited, where the U.S. is behind on, 50 out of the 57 or something like that, is there something broken with our innovation ecosystem that needs fixing? Or what is it that's allowed this to happen?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that is broken. I think people lose sight. Look, there are important discussions to be had. People talk about what is the influence of social media on children. Great topic. Let's have that discussion. But let's just make sure that when it comes to things like AI, that we are the most capable. Then we can talk about how to use AI, whether kids should have access to AI tools. We can have that discussion, but we should make sure that when it comes to which country has the most capability when it comes to AI, let's make sure that it's America first and foremost. and not do things that prevent us from being the #1 research country in the world when it comes to advanced AI capabilities.
Yeah.
Let's make sure that we are the best first and foremost, and then we can talk about how do we leverage and use these technologies. And America is very good at passing laws and regulations. Like we don't need to be better in that. I have full confidence that we will find ways to use our legal structures to protect people, but we have to make sure we're the best. Because if we're not the best, whoever controls things like AI or controls supply chain production and manufacturing production and all these things will just have an upper hand, and we will not be able to, I think, protect democracy as well as we have both at home and abroad, the way we have in the past. So I think it's critically important, and we constantly get stuck in our own country just with our own infighting about all these things when the first priority should be, let's make sure that we're the best. Then we can talk about how we use these capabilities and technologies. Because I promise you, our adversaries are not having that discussion. They're just saying, let's just be the best.
Yeah. And they're just moving. They're just moving.
They're just moving.
Yeah.
The other point I want to make, if I can make one more, is that we do sometimes get distracted. It is true. We are behind now in these 50 critical manufacturing and technology areas. We're behind now, and I think it's like 43 out of the 50 or 50 out of the 57 or whatever it is. We are behind. In some of those, we have to really have smart people in Washington understand and prioritize. But which are the ones we have to be more advanced in, and which ones are okay? So take shipbuilding, for instance. I read about all the time that China can build 400 naval ships per year. We can only build like 40 or something, maybe not even 40, less than that. And we have to catch up. We have to be able to build 400 naval ships per year. Well, I'm not sure that's true. I don't think we can actually win in our shipbuilding capabilities against China. They have such a huge advantage and head start. But maybe we can build 400 hypersonic missiles that can't be intercepted, that can just take out those 400 ships. Like let's use what America is great at and what our technological capabilities to build something to give us an advantage, and let's not get caught up in trying to beat China at their own game. Let's beat China in the games they can't win and that America can win.
Great point around prioritization, and I actually think that given how boisterous a democracy we have, and we have a federal system, and we have a massive private sector and investment community, getting people on the same page, it places a premium on the ability to do that and identify common ground. For the reasons you mentioned, we have a governance set up, a political system where people change in Congress regularly. The presidency changes every 4 years, right? And so I think that trying to figure out a way to identify what are those agreed upon principles that all of us can agree on is going to be essential. In fact, we've lost that muscle in a sense. Just 3 quick things to get your reaction. I'm also thinking about technology enablers, meaning things that have a spillover across a number of technologies. So one of them is energy. You talked about that. Another one could be labor. And you look at the AI data center agenda, we did some numbers on, if you took the high case scenario for how quickly, if this is a second industrial revolution, you would need something like 140,000, 100,000+ more welders, electricians, HVAC operators, construction workers between now and 2030. Like, that's a massive surge, and we don't have the apprenticeships to do that. Are you guys tracking that as well? Do you see something similar?
Yeah, it's a perfect example. We have an investment in a company in Texas called Base Power, and they need electricians to install their technology, their battery units and software in people's homes. And as they continue to scale up and grow, they are going to be gated by the number of electricians in the state of Texas. So I think that a company like that is looking at how do they work with vocational schools and other institutions of education to get people skilled and reskilled and trained and certified to be electricians in the state of Texas, and then they'll take that to other states. We have another investment in a company that does mental health services, and they are gated by the number of social workers that they can bring onto the team. So they are looking at how can we get more and more social workers trained, get them certified in their hours, and bring them to be able to provide more mental health services to patients all across America. So I think that this reskilling and vocational capability is super, super important. And we certainly look at that in our companies. More importantly, our companies are looking at that.
Yeah. David, this has been fascinating. For people who work in government, they often say, thank you for your service. But I got to say, as a private investor, hey, man, thank you for your service, because the ideas you're putting on the table, the investments you're making, this is the kind of thing, everyone has a role to play in this. And I just really want to thank you, and I appreciate your time and your insights, and we'll be watching what you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the discussion, and it was really great to be a part of this, and thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining today's insightful conversation with David Ulevitch, General Partner of Andreessen Horowitz. You can find this episode and more on CSIS.org, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. This is Navin Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play in the tech race.